I mean, it is a fair question. Should we have the profit motive in something as important as healthcare? That is a totally fair question. But I don't think you should assume the answer is no. From Yahoo Finance, this is Ballots and Dollars, a podcast about the politics that affect your pocketbook. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. Today we are talking about whether the public sector can do it better than the private sector when it comes to things like healthcare and climate change. It was a theme that emerged, Rick, from the first set of Democratic debates that we saw. And let's really dig in here. And I guess let's start with healthcare, which is really sort of, I would argue, the biggest topic, right? When you survey Americans, healthcare is right at the top of what they're concerned about. The argument that a lot of the Democrats put forth in these debates was, if you hand over the healthcare system to the government, we will do a better job for the American people than if it's in the hands of the private sector. First off, do you agree with that statement?
I don't inherently agree with that statement. And I felt like the Democrats in the first set of debates they never talked about it this way, but they were basically arguing about the profit motive. The force in capitalism that makes capitalism what it is and drives companies to be efficient and get the most for the least. So we heard Elizabeth Warren talk about this, Bernie Sanders talk about this, and healthcare was a big topic in those debates, as it should be, because it's a big issue for voters. And you sort of had this easy throwaway line that, the problem with the healthcare system as we have it is that the companies that are in the private healthcare system make a profit. And I think there was a figure at one point. I think Elizabeth Warren said a $23 billion profit, as if that's a terrible thing, because that's $23 billion that should instead be spent on patients and on providing care. And there's this idea that if you just rolled everything into a government program, well, what would otherwise be profit in the private sector would be extra money, found money in a public program, and you'd have all of that extra money to spend on patients. Except that's not how it works.
Right.
That's not how it works.
The word profit is a dirty word, I guess. So then, all right,
and it shouldn't be.
If they want to take this money, these profits, these dirty profits at these horrible,
basically saying what would otherwise be profits. In other words, we're going to have the same amount of, I guess, revenue coming into the public program through, again, this is all fuzzy because there are different ideas about how you fund all of this. And everything will be the same except what would otherwise be profits would be money that we can spend on patients and on patient care. And I think that's a total fallacy. So to go back to basics here, it is a fair question. Should we have the profit motive in something as important as healthcare? That is a totally fair question. But I don't think you should assume the answer is no. And what we know about the profit motive and the way private companies operate is when you have a profit motive, you have an incentive to provide the service or the good as efficiently as possible. That doesn't mean you're ripping off the consumer. That means you are figuring out how to take unnecessary cost out of the system, eliminate middlemen in terms of providing that service to the end user. Now, people are probably listening and say, what are you talking about? The healthcare system is just filled with middlemen. Mm-hmm. And I readily acknowledge we have a very, very complicated system. But if you think that the government is naturally the solution and that it would somehow all be simpler if this were in the public sector, think about the Postal Service.
Boy. That's been a debacle.
That is the closest thing we have to a company that is run by the government. And the Postal Service loses money I'm actually a fan of the Postal Service. I think it's too easy to bash the Postal Service. The Postal Service can deliver a letter to any address in the country in a couple of days.
Yeah, but Rick, they have
for less than $1.
I agree with you, but they haven't changed with the times. The internet is killing them,
right.
And they're a dinosaur.
Right.
And the government hasn't done anything in the way of keeping them relevant.
Right. And then the other example people like to throw out is think about the Department of Motor Vehicles. That is not that's a government agency. That's not really something like a company, which is why I like the Postal Service as a model. But so there are reasons the Postal Service is doesn't keep up and is inefficient in certain ways, and it always loses money and needs to get extra appropriations from Congress. One of the big problems is political interference, and this is a really good a reason not to have services offered through the government, because with regard to the Postal Service, no member of Congress will almost ever allow the Postal Service to close a post office in their district, even if it only serves 4 people a day.
Right.
So you cannot get rid of the underperforming part of the business. You don't have freedom to revamp the business when you need to.
They're just not nimble. The government, by definition, is just not a nimble organization.
That's correct.
And you need that, especially if you're going to take on something as massive as overhauling healthcare for this country.
So I think to go back to the healthcare system, I think it's unknowable whether we would be better off with for-profit companies providing the level of care that they do. They're not the only show in town. I mean, obviously, Medicare is a big part of the system, so is Medicaid. But let's remember, the doctors don't work for the government in Medicare and Medicaid. They work for private providers, and Medicare and Medicaid basically contracts with those providers and covers some of the costs. But for the private part of the system, I think we should assume that the private healthcare system actually does a good job of getting rid of unnecessary costs. And if their business model is not working because technology has changed or something has changed, the board of United Health or Aetna or CVS or whatever the company is gets together and says, we need to make changes. I mean, they can just do that because that's what companies do. They are run by CEOs who get paid a lot of money to, yes, make sure the company is profitable, but also make sure the company is doing what its customers want. And there is choice in the healthcare system. Our employer Verizon is a customer of insurance companies.
Right.
And if Verizon doesn't think it's getting a good deal from whatever insurance, it can go to the next guy and say, we think you can offer us a better deal. So in that regard, these much vilified, terrible insurance companies, they are responsible to customers, and they can move quickly in order to give their customers what they want. And I think it would be a big mistake to assume that the government would be able to do that better.
And I know transparency is a huge deal, and President Trump recently signed an order basically telling these companies, you better start letting us see how you price your drugs, why they're priced the way they are. And Senator Warren has actually thrown out the idea of the government. Is it making the drugs ourselves?
Yes.
Which sounds a little scary to me. Talk to us about that.
Well, it's two different things. So what Trump wants to do, and he's kind of on the right track, but I doubt he's going to get anywhere with this. This has been tried at the state level, and it's complicated. But the economists who study the healthcare system say, look, one of the problems is nobody knows what anything costs. So if you're a normal consumer, it's impossible to figure out where you're going to get the best deal. Let's say it's something that's not urgent and life-threatening. Let's say it's some kind of test or an MRI or even just an X-ray. You have no idea what anybody charges. You can't look it up on a website or anything. And the idea is that if you made the cost of these things transparent the way you can see what anything costs at Amazon or Walmart, for example, people would, spend the least for the most. It's just not that simple because of all the way these things get priced. There's not like a market price for a lot of this stuff. These are negotiated prices.
And I think I'm frustrated as a consumer. I recently had to get a topical. And the pharmacist told me, oh, that's $800. And when I picked myself up off the floor, I said, but you don't mean I'm paying for that, right? Isn't the insurance company? And you know what? He found a coupon from where I do not know that left my out-of-pocket cost at $0.
Wow.
Something's wrong with that picture. I'm glad I didn't
totally
have to
wrong with that picture.
But how do you go from something being a list price of $800 to then me not having to pay anything?
Nobody knows.
There's no transparency.
Nobody knows. Right. And just try this trick. Next time you have to go for some routine procedure or something, call the doctor up ahead of time and say, how much will this cost if I don't declare it on my insurance? They can't tell you. I did this once with a dermatologist.
Oh my gosh.
And the answer was, we can't tell you until after the visit. When we put it in the computer, and then the computer will tell us how much.
It just sounds creepy.
So it's a known problem. So that's one thing. But to go to Elizabeth Warren's idea, one of her ideas is that the government should actually manufacture generic drugs.
We're doomed.
When in certain categories, not across the board, but in certain categories, when there's not more than one affordable generic on the market, and there are a lot of categories like that.
I like the idea. Maybe you incentivize a private company to do that. The companies that actually know how to make the drugs.
So that is kind of what I'm getting at here. So we have different ways of approaching this problem. So let's go with her idea that the government should get into the manufacture of these drugs. Okay, the first thing I envision happening is a huge battle in Congress over which members of Congress are going to get the factories in their district and in their state.
Right.
And all the battling that's going to go on there. And, there will be a handful of winners. Let's say the government develops 4 places where there are goes and buys them. There are going to be all kinds of considerations about who gets those in their district that have nothing to do with the efficiency of manufacturing those drugs.
Yeah, again, politics gets in the way. Right.
So, if you were to frame it this way, would you rather let's say it's a trade-off between the political interference that is inevitable with anything that has to go through Congress and the profit motive? Pick your poison. I think that's a pretty good case for the profit motive.
And who's to say the government would be all that transparent? They haven't been in a lot of other ways,
exactly right?
So, all right, we tackled healthcare a little bit. We can go on and have hours and hours of a discussion on this, but I want to get to climate change.
We will. I think we will, but anyway,
we will. Well, Ballots and Dollars will be going on and on and on up to the November 2020 election. But talk to me about climate change. What were some of the ideas put forth by some of these Democratic candidates about taking it away from the private sector?
Yeah, so this is another big area, very important. It is a big issue more for Democrats, I think, than for Republicans, but climate change for sure is something that we're going to be hearing a lot about. So there are 2 basic strands of thinking here. One leans toward the Green New Deal, which is this just gigantic government program that would do all this new research. It would kind of direct the automotive industry about what kinds of vehicles to produce. It would do the same thing with energy. Basically, a real heavy government hand in every industry that in some way has to do with climate. So that is mostly transportation and energy, but also home building, real estate, construction.
Solar companies.
Yeah, so new rules on how to build homes and telling you how to do it and funding this research and stuff like that. So that's the Green New Deal. That is one approach, which is just have the government do it all. And then the more market-oriented approach is don't have the government do it all, but use something like a carbon tax, which is a government rule or a government incentive for private industry to figure out how to meet targets as efficiently as possible.
Okay.
That, to me, is a better idea.
Right. So it would take some of the best of the new Green Deal and form something else, would you say? Or no, it's so different from that.
Not even. I think they're very different. And of course, you could have a spectrum of programs that incorporate some of all of this. Mm-hmm. But there have been carbon taxes put in place in Europe and other places. And the way this works is the government does have a role. The government says we're going to put a price on carbon emissions. So every entity that generates some kind of carbon, you're going to have to pay to do that. And the cost of that, one of the ways you would do this is phase it in over time so that the cost isn't crippling at the beginning, but it gets higher and higher and higher, and everybody knows the cost is going to get higher, and they know when the cost is going to get higher. So, and then you can trade pollution credits. So if you need to buy credits because you pollute more, you can choose to do that. Let's say you're a power utility. You can, if you are more efficient than the market average, you can sell credits. If you're less efficient, you can buy credits. And then you have to explain to your customers why you're paying more. Uh-huh. And when this is kind of an open market, all the polluters decide. They make choices. They say it's better for me to spend the money to cut back on emissions than to buy the credits. And as the cost of the credits goes up over time, you're going to get fewer. You're going to get lower and lower emissions. This is kind of how we solved the acid rain problem in the 1970s and 1980s. You just continually raise the cost of the pollution and let the market figure out the best way, the most efficient way to get that done.
Yeah, it becomes too expensive and onerous for them to not comply, so they'll find a way to comply.
So it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect here. Mm-hmm. And you can point to abuses or inefficiencies in any system, but people who say just the private market has failed to do these things, let's just let the government do it. I think one thing they have very wrong is that It's not the private market that has failed. The government has never created the incentives for the private market to get it done or for private industry to get it done.
I'm sure they'd agree with you.
So I think probably before, in these big things we're talking about, the government should probably be the last resort after you have exhausted all other things. And we have not exhausted all other things yet.
But doesn't this give President Trump more ammunition when he's going to broad stroke paint the Democrats as socialists as we move closer to Election Day?
Yes.
With ideas like these.
And I think that's why you're hearing some Democrats pushing back on these ideas where you're just going to have the government step in to solve every problem. I mean, you're hearing John Hickenlooper, the former governor of Colorado.
Who you spoke to, right?
He pushes back on this, yes. And he actually said in his debate, we can't let them characterize us as socialist. Michael Bennet, who's the senator from Colorado, is pushing back on this. Tim Ryan. These tend to be the lesser-known candidates. And then you've got Joe Biden, who I think we're kind of waiting. We generally considered a business-friendly centrist, but he seems to realize he needs to move to the left on some issues. And I think we're kind of waiting to see how far on the left he's going to move and whether he's really going to become forceful on some of these issues or whether he's going to vacillate and not really endorse one program or another.
Who do you think – I mean, it's still the very early going and it's still a very, very crowded race. Is there a front runner for you when it comes to health care? Somebody who has a plan that could actually be feasible on some level? There
are a few. And, I've talked about this. Medicare for All is not a pragmatic solution to me. Michael Bennet, the senator from Colorado, he sponsors legislation in Congress that would create a plan called MedicareX. So this would be a new public health care plan for people who don't get coverage they can afford through an employer or some other means. And it would not be Medicare, but it would be administered by the same agency that runs Medicare. So you'd get to take advantage of that overhead.
Who would fund it, did he say?
The users would fund it.
Okay.
You would pay premiums to be part of this program. So no new taxes, and because the buying pool would be large and you'd get to take advantage of Medicare's overhead, which is already there, in theory, and I think it's a pretty good theory.
You'd have cheaper premiums.
Probably,
okay.
yeah, for than people who just don't have good choices. One other way this sort of discussion, this background discussion about the profit motive is manifesting itself is the argument over companies that don't pay enough in taxes. So Amazon has now become the poster child for this. And now we don't really know exactly what Amazon pays in taxes. This has been kind of an inference that's been done by some interest groups that are running through the numbers and trying to figure it out.
Who actually believe Amazon paid no money in taxes.
Yeah, that's right, which is possible. But Amazon, if Amazon's tax bill is, and by the way, they do pay all those payroll taxes, that fund Social Security and Medicare, just like their employees pay those taxes. But if Amazon's federal tax bill in 2018 really was zero, it's not because Amazon is cheating.
Right.
It's because Amazon
legally doing this.
is taking advantage of legal provisions in the tax code that are meant to incentivize things like research, like investment. When you invest. Yes.
HQ2.
They
so
Amazon
are
has grown
creating jobs.
From a one-person company in 1995 to a company that employs 600,000 people right now.
Right. So
that's what the tax code is trying to do. That's the point of those incentives in the tax code. So get your story straight, Washington. If you want incentives in the tax code that will help inculcate small companies so that they can grow and become larger companies, then stop complaining when that works.
Right. Yeah, I think, there can't be a period at the end of the sentence when you say Amazon didn't pay any federal taxes. Boom. You need to explain the other things they're doing that are all legal, that are actually creating opportunities.
So if there is some flaw in the tax code, then fix the tax code.
Right.
Amazon. It's not Amazon's fault that they're or any company. I think for companies that are move profits offshore and use weird tax havens in Bermuda or whatever, and that's probably not too many public companies, but I think probably a lot of private companies do stuff like that. That's kind of if you're creating overseas tax havens, or things like corporate inversions, technically legal but shady, and just don't kind of don't feel right.
We know Congress works at a snail's pace, moves at a snail's pace with anything. And during these debates, at least the first round, they were asked to very succinctly say what their number one thing would be if they can get one thing done during their administration.
And hardly any of them were succinct.
No, that's very true, too.
That drove me crazy.
Yeah.
It's like, no, answer the question in 5 seconds. And every goddamn one of them just went on for
because they think they're the exception. Don't I get 25
Don't get
questions?
me started.
I hear you. But I'm wondering whether or not they would even bother to change the tax code. Apparently, a lot of them answered climate change as their number one thing that they would actually tackle and think that they could get done during their administration.
Well, a lot of the Democrats they do have higher taxes in their plan. But it's not higher taxes for the sake of higher taxes. It's usually to fund some new benefit program. And by the way, I don't think one of them says we need to raise taxes just to bring in more federal revenue to lower the federal deficit.
Yeah, we didn't hear that.
And attack the national debt. Nobody cares about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of them do want to raise taxes in one way or another. And in general, those tax increases would be on wealthy people and businesses. And Bernie Sanders actually acknowledged that he would raise taxes on middle-class families. I mean, I'm glad he acknowledged that.
Yeah, he has to pay for his Medicare for all somehow.
I think he really kind of ducked in 2016 when people asked him, well, how would you pay for this? And now he is at least saying, well, the way to pay for it is with higher taxes. But what you would pay in additional taxes, and these are probably back-of-the-envelope figures, would be half of what you're paying in healthcare expenses today. So you'd all be better off in the bargain. Sounds like something for nothing.
Yeah,
I'm a little suspicious.
I think a little suspicious, even amongst their colleagues up there at the podium for these debates. All right, this is going to continue, but this debate of whether or not things should be private or public, and whose hands are they better off? And private prisons were even mentioned. Yeah,
that's another one. And Cory Booker had a line along the lines of it's just terrible that we have companies profiting on the pain of Americans. And it's worth revisiting why we have private prisons. Now, there is certainly lobbying that goes on here and probably favors from lawmakers in the who have these prisons in their district. By the way, if we could Elizabeth Warren wants to put really strict restrictions on lobbying, and it's hard to argue with that because there is basically legalized corruption in Washington with all the lobbying and the members of Congress who retire and go straight to work at a lobbying firm.
That's what it amounts to, yeah.
But there's a reason that we have private prisons. In theory, it's a decent one, and it's the same reason that in the 90s it was very sort of popular to outsource all these government functions. I mean, Bill Clinton and Al Gore had RIGO, reinventing government, and part of that was just outsource whatever you can outsource to the private sector. Do it because they could demonstrate that you can lower the cost, even when the private sector
think now.
Even when the private sector is making a profit on it, they can do it cheaper than a government agency that has zero incentive to become more efficient. So private prison. The idea with private
Senator Warren
prisons,
wants to ban them.
That is the idea with private prisons is. That the profit motive creates an incentive to run these prisons as efficiently as possible. And the private sector can do that better than the public sector. So, of course, what happens is they want to cut costs. They might be cutting costs in ways that are abusive to inmates. But if you're worried about that, just set the rules that tell you what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do.
And penalize them if they don't live by those rules.
Yes, that's right. And make the penalties stiff.
Well, I'll tell you what, 3 large banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, have caved to shareholder and activists out there who demanded that they no longer do business with these private detention centers and prisons. So we'll have to see if other banks follow suit. That's
also part of the private sector. I mean, that is shareholders. That is our society and our economy working because shareholders want to express that point of view. I mean, to me, it's totally fair.
Yeah. Could also be an opportunity for the local banks.
Shareholders have a say.
Yeah.
And CEOs can either agree with their shareholders and do what they ask or not do what they ask and deal with the consequences of that. We're seeing it play out with Wayfair and that is supplying beds to one of the agencies that houses asylum seekers. I don't actually know what the right answer is. Should nobody
workers from Wayfair protested outside their headquarters about this.
Should no U.S. companies sell beds to those agencies?
Right. Well, yes, according to some of these senators, yes.
So they can't buy beds?
Survive.
Should these agencies only buy beds from foreign companies?
Yeah.
Or should they not even provide beds for these refugees?
Too many of the ideas I'm hearing from these Democratic candidates is all or nothing. And
I think that's right.
Yeah, not a lot of room for compromise. As always, the conversation will continue, but for now, we want to thank everybody for listening to Ballots and Dollars from Yahoo Finance. You can follow us on Twitter at Alexis TV News and
Rick J. Newman.
All right.
Twitter.
We will be back next week with another new episode. So in the meantime, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating.
Is that the highest? 5?
Yes, it is.
Can you give 6?
Maybe they will.
Find a way.